My last name is 6 meters. I was born in 1930, 1941. November 2000. After the start of the war in November, the Germans came to the city. Then we have 8 people in our family. These are 6 children, father and mother. When the Germans came to the city, my father was already elderly, and we did not survive the war in the city. We need to move to the village. And we went to an area 12 kilometers from the steppe to the village. This village was called Kirovsky, Saki region. We lived in this village for 3 years during the war on May 18, 1944. At 3 o'clock, 2 soldiers with machine guns burst into our house. And before that, a week before, my father and brother were taken away. Well, then, apparently, there was an instruction to remove the male population so that there would be no possible conflict. They invited us. There were 5 children and a mother of 6 people. Well, at 3 o'clock the soldiers burst in with machine guns. Get up, we'll take you out. Nothing was calculated. They said you were released. Then, but they didn't say where else. They called me a traitor. They gave me 5 minutes of time, because in our village there was a Russian village, and 4 Tatar families lived in the village. And in those 5 minutes, they were all in those houses. There were other soldiers in our house, other soldiers. And within 5 minutes they loaded him onto a car and drove him to the city.
And they didn't explain to you where?
No, they didn't say where, why. They told me that you were evicted from Crimea as traitors to the motherland.
How much time were you given to get ready?
5 minutes to 4 of 4 we had their soldiers assigned to all the families. And they immediately took out the flag and the hat and took it to the railway station. There were already wagons there, freight wagons, and there were already people. People who were being loaded, apparently. And the closest ones had all been brought earlier and were already loaded into the wagons.
And what kind of food items do you need in what quantities?
Did the products tell you how much you can take? Take it all. And there, as we later realized in other villages where Tatars live compactly, they could not raise people within 5 minutes. It had already been there for an hour and a half. They explained it to people, and then the soldiers were different. The soldiers were brutally disposed. But they were explained that you should not go out. These are traitors. And there were soldiers who were good-natured sympathizers in other villages where there were Tatar villages. There they explained to people, let's collect what you can, take it with you, because the road is long. We told people there, but they didn't tell us anything like that.
Some kind of violence was used against you or your family, members of your family.
There was no violence. They just pushed with a butt, pushed, got out, and that's it.
What were they wearing? The fact that I'm already on the air?
That's what we wore, and that's what we left in.
Where do you say where you were gathered?
Everyone was gathered in Saki at the railway station.
How long were you kept there?
So far I remember the train, until the train is full.
How did they treat you at the station?
Well, the station was simply being pushed into the cars. All the carriages pushed the entire crowd with sticks and butts. That's all.
What kind of transport did they take you to the railway station? Were you driven to the station by car?
Well, those soldiers who were evicting them were also in the car.
How many people were evicted from your home by your families, and how many people were in your family?
My father and brother were not there, so 6 people were evicted. For sisters, my mother and I evicted 5 people.
The whole family got into one carriage.
The whole family got into one carriage. The whole family was crying. These 6 people were taken from the house.
How many people were in the carriage?
There was very little room to step into the carriage. And so the carriage was packed. The freight car was completely packed. There was nowhere to go to the east. After all, some kind of sanitary conditions. There were, of course. There was even a shelf made on the shelf, so it could sit on the shelf. It was also full and on the shelf in this freight car of equal conditions. There were no sanitary conditions. It's not that there's a difference, there was some kind of capacity in this capacity on. And when he was guarding it at the station, they took it out and poured it. And again, everyone was fed something during the trip.
Who had what?
In my opinion, they carried it in buckets, which is not enough.
Who was there? This is what they ate. Whoever could take what?
For someone, the one who walked. I took it, but who could take it? I say the Slavs. Not only our family was there, but also our 3 families, several families from villages. And they were allowed to take those villages that were compact and completely Tatars. These will lead far. They will lead and take care of it for a long time. That's what they were told. They took it. And so they were there. They had food. There was flour. There were potatoes. There was milk. And when the carriage stopped, all the people got out. They were allowed to get out right away. There was some kind of costume they made. What could they do? Who could buy a book? The train screamed and that's it. Everyone got into the carriage at once. Everything remained on the street.
And how often did the train give orders?
Well, he stopped for an hour and a long time. And then he stopped often at stations. When people died, people were thrown away. The entrance was, we were people, sick people who they were dying. When the train stopped, they carried out the dead and left them. Just on. The street, and there was nowhere else to be. It was impossible to bury it. They didn't give it.
They didn't give you the opportunity, right? That is, they simply carried out a dead body and they were thrown out into the street, and that was that. Everyone in your family came before our family, yes?
Everyone was alive. Everyone was alive. And for a very long time, it was 18-20 days. Probably through Kazakhstan, Russia, through Kazakhstan. The steppes were brought to Uzbekistan. They were brought to Uzbekistan. Well, it is clear that Crimea, the European part, was brought to Uzbekistan, to Central Asia. They're already in the month of June, in the middle. And it was already hot there, 50 degrees hot, 50 degrees hot. And now we have to imagine a person who came from Europe, and so, the climate there brought them into such heat. It was impossible not to breathe. In the water there was halva already so big. These ones are like the Canary Islands, here. And there was water, hot water. And from there they took it for transfer. And dysentery began. The disease began by winter, by summer. By winter people had already begun to die. Because already cold, sick people began to die by winter.
When did you arrive? How was the reception organized? That is, how did people greet you?
What about the reception? Well, then they already wrote the year 44. The Uzbeks were a dark people, a downtrodden dark people. The Uzbeks were a backwater. They were prepared, of course, that they were coming, of all people. They were traitors. They were traitors to their homeland. They would populate. Were people so prepared for you? Well, they are dark people. They knew nothing, understood nothing. And when they brought us, he was afraid of everything, he called it.
How did you get to the station before mine? When they were transporting you, they brought you first.
Well, 150 kilometers from Tashkent, by the way, was the name of the station. Why did they bring such a station there? And from there they began distributing the train to the villages. Gorbachev came. And from there they started distributing people to villages in this region, who to where. And we got there, everything around was called a state farm. And here, these are cotton villages, there is a cold steppe, in short. And so we got there, the barracks were ready to disentangle at that time. And they settled us in a rock. There was nothing there, except straw. Barak was a familiar face to everyone. And so here we are, the 6 of us. Then my brother found ours. And 7 of us already settled in this barracks. Like there was no father.
How did the local authorities treat you? Well, in general, how did the population feel about the Crimean Tatars?
Well, Uzbeks, of course, are Muslims too. They were wary and mistrustful of us at first. And then, when we realized that we, too, are people just like them, only Europeans. Muslims, well, after a month, after 2 months, they began to have a completely different attitude.
Your children.
And before that, of course, they were wary, because it was explained to them that such people were being taken by dangerous people.
But they didn't do anything bad to you.
No, they didn't do anything wrong, and they could do everything. But when summer came, there was nothing to eat. So people were looking for food, and they were collecting corn in the cornfields.
Well, that's when you.
They brought it when they brought it to Uzbekistan. And the Uzbeks were like very Russian people. On the site, women and girls were killed and raped with corn. Here is a field of corn. That's how it was at first. At first it was like that. Well, then later, by the summer, by the winter, illnesses began, terrible dysentery began, people had allergies. People began to die. People began to die by winter already in the month of February. Father has arrived. Father has arrived. It turns out he was in the city of Tula, working in a mine. He came, found us in Beirut, saw our condition, how we were all lying flat, cold winter, cold, and I also immediately fell ill. And by the summer of 1945, 4 people in our families died from hunger and dysentery. My father died and 404 of my sisters died. I stayed alive, walked around with a knapsack, begging. The rest are brother and sister, and we beg. And my Russian family saved me from starvation. I could have died too, but my Russian family saved me from starvation. I went begging, and my mother was also in such a state that she could no longer walk on the mummy's bones alone. These are the breads I invited. That's how we survived. 4 of us survived, our family died, but we only had a sister. Don't know. The family was called wife and brother. My mother and I remained, 4 people remained, mother, brother, and I, and Selaverstav, sister, 4 sisters and father died. There were 8 of us in the family, 8 people died, 4 remained. So, bury. How to bury? People, I said so. People died out in families. We had 4 people who died in our families. We didn't have the strength to bury them. People among people who in 405, soldiers returned from the front. The war is over, the war is over. Soldiers returned from the front, officers, soldiers, Crimean Tatars. So there the commandant tore off their shoulder straps.
That they fought.
He wore them in military uniform, with orders and medals. He tore off their shoulder straps and also registered them as special officers at the commandant's office. Commandant's office. But that, despite the fact that they fought at the front. And these people were still more or less as healthy in the summer of 405, so they, too, were already exhausted for several months, and they, too, dug out. That's how much earth to dig up. And then they laid the dead man down and buried him. When we arrived in the morning, we heard a howl, a cry, jackals in the village. The jackals were shouting this. And in the morning the dead people arrived. The same ones were pulled out by jackals. That's how it was. It was.
When did you return to Crimea and where then?
I moved to Kerch already by the year 507. I had already grown stronger, moved to the city, draws a Tashkent counter. And there I had a Russian comrade. He told me how the meter was delivered. The brick was brought to the Tatar station. People were told that they were taking them to fly in. He told me this guy my age. He was 13 years old then. He told me when they brought him. He went out, he brought him, walked up to the station. They were already ready with fittings and pipes. All the people who met traitors are, well, dangerous people. And when he stopped, the train stopped. They heard groans, crying, groans of people when they opened fire. And people began to fall out, and he said, I felt ashamed. I began to hide the fittings. They began to hide these pipes with fittings and left from there. We realized that these were women. The children brought them. That's how the emergency happened. This guy told me. Well, this year I took over Kerch, got a job at a factory, and the guy has been sitting there all year, such a strong guy. I haven't been for 20 plus years in the 8th year. It's been 26 years now for 6 years. I met a girl, one of them was her name. And then, at 58, they got married.
When we returned to Crimea,
Crimea, I returned. The family remained now in Crimea. I returned in 706. In 709. Because in 56, the 20th Congress rehabilitated Khrushchev, I have a certain nation who were also expelled. These are Chechens, Ingush, Karachais, Kalmyks. They were returned to their homeland, They were returned to the Crimean Tatars, and the Volga Germans were only allowed to live within Russia.
in
Crimea. Yes, the Union had no right to return to Crimea. This was the decree in 1968. Well, I came on my own in 1969 and went without a registration for a whole year.
Where did you return? Where?
I returned to the Seit-Veli district because I was evicted from the Seit-Veli district. I returned to Ukraine. When I was a child, I was 12 years old. My mother and I sometimes walked, and my mother sang very well, and she told me, "Son, sing a song." And I started singing along the way. We were going with my mother, and I sang and began to sing Tatar songs. I had such a ringing voice. Here. And when they brought us to Uzbekistan, we were already there 50. Now I had already graduated from school, and I had a desire. I already had a voice, and I had a desire to sing. And I went to Samarkand. Entered the music school. Entered the music school in the vocal department. So I studied there very well. I studied well. I received. Then there was a Stalinist scholarship. Excellent students were given Stalinist scholarships. So I was an excellent student, and that's why I was given a Stalinist scholarship. I lived in a dormitory and studied at a music school in the vocal department. So I studied, but they predicted a great future for me as a singer. Great future. But I decided to go to Moscow. I decided to go to Moscow to enter the conservatory, but there was no ticket to go to Moscow by train. I'm the enemy there, and it was impossible to go there. I wanted to go, but it was impossible. The curfew regime meant that you couldn't go to another Moscow, and you couldn't go. So I was on the train. There the enemy in the vestibule was traveling to Moscow. He arrived in Moscow. And if you went, remember, there was a movie about one girl called Come Tomorrow. There was a good girl from Siberia. She also came to enroll in Moscow, but she was much later. Of course, my father and I went to Moscow in the 3rd and 4th year after finishing the 1st year, and he also tried to get me to audition. The professor also sat there, the name of the professor. I go to him. Listen, please, you listen to me, and this is how I am. But this was much earlier than this girl entered the conservatory. So he listened to me, and the accompanist called me in the same way. He knew that the assembly hall came on stage. I'm glad you'll sing. I said this is a young guy. He sang and said to me, okay, we'll take you, we believe you. I then told him, please, tell me, allow me to go to Uzbekistan to register. Me too. I am a Crimean Tatar. I am on resettlement. He then said, then go and get your documents and permission. And then he will come to us. And that's how I returned to Uzbekistan. When I returned to Uzbekistan, this commandant, his last name was Maslov, the commandant called my mother, beat her well to the commandant's office. Why didn't your son come to Moscow? And when I came back, they told me that he beat the commandant's mother and that he was waiting for you here too. I come to his office, he is sitting at the table. Just like that, he has an inkwell on his desk. And then there were inkwells for potassium ink, and there were such large glass inkwells, I go up to him to the desk of the bureau with this inkwell and straight into his forehead. And then I was already healthy head to head, and he grabbed it. So here's everything for you. And then it was like this from one village to another village. Crimean Tatars are allowed. There was no way to go through the curfew regime. It was such a strict regime. And I went to Moscow, and he said we'll provide for you for 25 years. You broke the law. Besides, you are guaranteed 25 years. Well, then she put me in jail, and our people in the village were militants, that I was the commandant. All the old people put me in jail, women and men gathered and began to beg him. Sorry, he's a young guy, according to him. Well, he then seemed to take pity on me and said, I forgive you, but you won't leave the state farm anywhere together. So you will work in the field. This is the only way I will forgive you, otherwise 25 years. Well, that's how it happened. I stayed in the village and started going to work in the fields and picking cotton. That's how I found it. Well, I've already found everything. And just like that, my musical vocal activity was over.